Well, hey everybody, thanks for taking a few weeks to read and discuss how to be rich. The Be Rich journey began for me several years ago while I was preparing a message series on the subject of stewardship for our local churches. While studying, I ran across something the Apostle Paul wrote to his protege Timothy, and here's what he said. He said, "Command those who are rich in this present world." And then he goes on from there to explain what Timothy was to explain to these people about how to be rich. Now, when I read that, I think what most people think, I thought, well, I can skip this because I'm not rich, and these are instructions to rich people, and the people in my churches don't consider themselves rich. You know, rich is that other guy, rich is that other family. Rich is the person who has more than me, right? Which means, of course, that nobody's rich, but everybody knows someone who's rich. But then I got to thinking, I have been to some places in the world, perhaps like you, where I was the rich guy. Places where if you could afford a plane ticket and a hotel room, or you had a network that allowed you to raise money for a ticket and a hotel room, then you were rich by comparison. And like you, I have visited places where I felt very rich in this present world. Then, like most people, I came back home, shook it off, and got back to comparing myself to the people who had more than me, those rich people. So I decided that instead of skipping these verses, I would teach them to our congregation. Because after all, compared to some people, many of us are in fact rich in this present world. But as I began preparing for the series, I discovered something startling. Not only are most of the people in my churches rich compared to some people in this world, we are rich compared to many people in the world. We're compared to most people in the world. Now, here's a statistic that you're going to find hard to digest. If you make $48,000 a year, you are in the top 1% of the wage earners in the whole world. $48,000. If you make $48,000 a year, you are in fact rich in this present world. But discovering that doesn't make you feel any better about your current situation, does it? Nobody sees this stat and then jumps up and says, I'm rich, and nobody in your small group is tempted to hit the pause button right now so that you guys can have a group hug, huh? Discovering just how much better off you are than most of the people in the world really doesn't do much for you, except maybe elicit a little bit of guilt, which a trip to the mall will take care of, right? Now, the reason this is important is that if you're going to take the Apostle Paul's instructions to rich people seriously, then first you've got to embrace the fact that you're rich. And hopefully, by the time you finish the first 2 chapters in the book, you will be thoroughly convinced that you are in fact rich. But since you probably haven't read that far yet, let me prime the pump a little bit for the journey that we're going to take together. The reason that stat, the $48,000 stat, the reason it didn't do that much for you is this. Wealth has side effects. Now, I'm going to talk about some of these in more detail in our second video, but I want to touch on 3 of these side effects in this session to get you thinking and to give you something to discuss during the discussion portion of your group. To begin with, rich people confuse being rich with feeling rich. Rich people always confuse being rich with feeling rich. Now, many of you are in fact rich in this present world, but you don't feel it, do you? And the truth is, we want to feel it, don't we? I mean, feeling rich is what makes being rich fun. Think about it for just a minute. Think about this. When was the last time, or perhaps the only time, that you felt rich? When was the last time or the only time, or maybe you can think back to the first time that you actually felt rich? I remember the first time. The first time I felt rich was in the 10th grade. I worked at Winn-Dixie, a local grocery store in our area, and I worked for minimum wage. I had no bills, and I lived at home. I would get my paycheck, deposit it, and then I began to watch that balance grow. And I would dream of all the things that I could afford but chose not to as I watched my balance grow. And I felt so rich. Now, here's the interesting thing. I've never had less money. I've never had less stuff or responsibility, but I've never felt more rich. And I bet you have a similar story. So, the moral of that story is, if you want to feel rich, get a minimum wage job and move in with your parents, right? Now, for some of you that's funny, but for some of you it's not funny at all, because maybe that's exactly where you are. You are working a minimum wage job, and perhaps you're still living with your parents. But the reason you don't feel rich is that you don't have the one thing that makes all the difference. The thing that came easily for me in the 10th grade that has never been easy since. And that one thing is margin. You see, I didn't have a lot of money, but I had margin. Margin is extra. It's the buffer. You know what it is? It's the freedom to spend more combined with the willpower to spend less. And margin, don't miss this, margin is the key to feeling rich. And a lack of margin is what causes so many rich people to conclude that they're in fact not rich. Now, some of you, let's be honest, some of you are living rich, but you don't feel it because you don't have any margin. So, if you want to feel rich, if the goal isn't to simply be rich, but to feel rich, and again, rich people confuse these two things. If you want to feel rich, here's the secret. Downsize until you have margin, then you'll feel rich. Now, when I say that, if there's like a sense of terror that rises up on the inside of you, if the thought of selling your home or driving an older car or putting your kids in public school causes you to break out in a sweat, I have some great news. That's just one more bit of evidence that you are in fact rich. That thing in you that can't bear the thought of stepping back in terms of your standard of living is evidence of the fact that you're suffering from something else rich people suffer from. It's another side effect, and here it is. Rich people are plagued by discontentment. Rich people are actually plagued by discontentment. Now, here's something I bet that you've noticed. The more people have, the more people want. Isn't that true? Wait, I'm sorry. This is a group study, so let me make it more personal. The more you have, the more you want, right? Now think of this. Your desire, and we all have this, your desire for newer and nicer is actually an appetite. And your appetites, all of your appetites really have a one-word vocabulary, and that word is more. When you feed an appetite, think with me now, when you feed an appetite, what happens to it? What happens when you feed an appetite? That's right, it grows. Appetites are never fully and finally satisfied ever. You think that if you had just a bit more, you'd be done, you'd be fine, but you would be wrong. Because every time you feed that appetite for newer and nicer, what happens to it? It grows. And then here's the tricky thing. As your appetite for newer and nicer grows, it begins to erode your margin, which erodes your well-being. And the next thing you know, you're one of those rich people that feels financial pressure. And how absurd is that? Imagine this. Imagine walking through the slums of a third world country, or perhaps a government project in your own community, sitting down with one of the residents and trying to explain to them the financial pressure that you feel. It would be embarrassing, wouldn't it? And it should be. And I'll tell you what your problem is, and you're not going to like this. You're rich, but you're not very good at it. No one ever taught you how to be rich. Now, before you decide to choose another small group study, allow me to make one more point in this regard. Have you ever heard of this? You familiar with this term? Upgrade? Upgrade. This is something that rich people do all the time. In fact, this is probably the reason, or this probably accounts for more margin erosion than anything else rich people do. And here's how it works. Rich people don't like to wait for things to break. That's like so 20th century. Rich people take things that work and then they give them away, and then they go out and buy pretty much the same stuff that they gave away, only newer and nicer. Perhaps you've seen this. Perhaps you've done this. In some extreme cases, they trade in a perfectly good item for an almost identical item that's newer and nicer, and then, in addition to trading in what they had, they give a vendor money. For example, I know rich people who will drive a perfectly good car to a car dealership and leave it there and then give the dealer money. I know it's crazy. And in exchange for a perfectly good car and money, they drive off in a car. That's the kind of thing rich people do. Again, we're going to explore that further next week. But this may come as good news. If you have ever traded a car that works for a newer and nicer car, a newer and nicer model, you're rich. Now, this newer and nicer trend explains in part stories that we've heard all our lives, stories of people with cash flow and income streams that we can't even begin to imagine, like the super rich people. The stories of the super rich people having to declare bankruptcy. You've heard these stories? And here's what we think. We think, how could someone with that much money get upside down financially? And the answer is simple. No one taught them how to be rich. Think about this. A person in that situation goes for years, in some cases, for years, feeling more financial pressure than you do, even though they have far more money than you do. Why? Because wealth has side effects. Now, okay, one more side effect in this session. You ready? Here's the last one. Rich people suffer from what we're going to call the migration of hope. And we're going to talk a lot about this in this series. Rich people suffer from what we're going to call the migration of hope. Over time, wealth becomes a substitute for God. Now, but without meaning to, and we're all susceptible to this, without meaning to, we allow our hope to shift from God's promise to care for us to our ability to hoard in order to protect our future. Now, to kind of put this in perspective, here's a question that we're going to wrestle with throughout our time together, especially in regard to the migration of hope. Look at this. How much money would you need to secure your future, specifically your financial future? How much money would you need to secure your future against all imaginable eventualities? How much money or how much wealth would you need to ensure that you are absolutely safe, that nothing could bring you down? Now, here's the interesting thing. We've never met, but I know the answer to that question. I know how you would answer that question. And the answer is more than you currently have. Isn't that right? And you know what? No matter how much wealth you accumulate, that will always be the answer to that question. And yet, in spite of that, I mean, we know that, in spite of that, for rich people, for rich Christians, the fear of the future has a tendency to drive us toward a very self-centered posture regarding our money. Isn't that true? In an attempt to secure our future, which is really God's responsibility, we find it more and more difficult to give generously. Think about this. More and more difficult to give generously to the things that God, who we're supposed to trust to secure our financial future, to the things that God is most concerned about in this world. So what happens? Our hope migrates from our dependence on God to dependence on our ability to protect ourselves financially. Now, we're going to come back to that one in a couple of weeks. So, wrapping up, here's the good news. You're probably rich, or odds are in this world there's somebody who thinks that you are, and you probably suffer, and here's the bad news, you probably suffer from one or more of these side effects, or at least your spouse does, or perhaps the person to your left. So, if in fact you are rich, here's the question we've got to wrestle to the ground. Do you know how to be rich? Do you know how to be rich? We're going to come back to that week after week after week in this study. Hey, thank you so much for inviting me into your home. I hope that you'll have me back next time, and I hope that you enjoy the book, but most of all, I hope that through this study, God does something in you that will make you an even better steward of the resources that He has put at your disposal. This time, I'm going to turn it over to your group facilitator. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll see you next time.